Hello and welcome back to Philosophy and Humor. And this week we're looking at Incongruity Theories of Humor for Module 5. We talked very briefly about this form of humor a couple of weeks ago when we talked about Aristotle and his disagreement with Plato regarding the fact that we laugh at people rather than what Aristotle presents to us, which is the possibility of laughing at virtually anything, animals or ourselves or a particular state of nature. It doesn't matter what it is, but we can laugh at a variety of different things and not feel a sense of superiority. So very quickly, as we normally do with the beginning of each of the modules, we go briefly through the last week's material. We talked about laughter derived from a sense of pleasure at another person's pain, or their infirmity of some sort, or something that can be changed. It may be something that it makes those people really obnoxious, but if it is really inclusive and universal, it should be something that person can change. Their hypocrisy, for example, their sense of self-worth and narcissism, these kinds of things can be made fun of because they can be corrected. So Rene Descartes, the first philosopher that we looked at, talked about the explosive and aggressive nature of humor, that this kind of laughter is more related to scorn and malice and mockery. It is a very sort of nasty kind of way to make fun of people, to be satirical towards them. But like Plato, Descartes also believed that humor could have a positive function, which is to use it in a kind of pedagogical or educational kind of way. And we can use satire in a socially positive way by, again, pointing out infirmaries or deficiencies that people have that can be changed. We also looked at Thomas Hobbes and the notion of laughter as sudden glory. And this notion of sudden glory is what arises within us when we suddenly feel that we have identified something that someone else has done. It can be ourselves as well. But what someone has done that we recognize as ludicrous or just plain wrong. And it's wrong because it defies social norms and expectations. So our sudden glory is to laugh at some person's momentary forgetfulness of what is the proper way to do things. So that sudden glory is also can be self-directed when we realize that we've been doing something wrong for a period of time. And we suddenly have someone show it to us that this is in fact the correct way to do something. And the worst thing is when a child does that, to us, hey, listen, Dad, that's how you do it. And someone else is watching. Yeah, that sudden glory is partly what the viewers can experience, but also yourself, because you realize, okay, I was doing something wrong. I admit it. Now, Bergson also talked about this really important idea of élan vital, that kind of vital force that identifies us as creative individuals. We have a degree of creativity, self-creation, and whenever we lose sight of that, we're losing sight of that single element that makes us who we are, human beings, right? That ability to be creative. And when we lose that, we become more rigid rather than elastic. We become inflexible rather than flexible. There's potential for humor because, again, it's based partly on an acknowledgement of social norms, an acknowledgement of the social mores and traditions and expected behavior. Now, expected behavior becomes something very important that we're going to look at today as well. Now, finally, John Morial, in his book, makes a really interesting distinction between the tragic hero versus the comedic hero. And he says the main idea that we need to keep in mind, and this ties in nicely with Bergson's idea of this creative force, is the contrast between mental rigidity, which is the tragic hero, versus mental flexibility, which is comedy. So if we live, or if we have a tragic view of the world, we live in this kind of inflexible, idealistic kind of world, and we think that things can only be done one way and one way only. And if you do that, it's ripe for tragedy because you need to be able to kind of stick handle through life, as it were. But if you can be more pragmatic and more flexible, think more intuitively, think on your feet, have a plan B, whatever metaphor you want to use, you're more likely to see the humor in it. And again, this idea is important in this week's lesson as well, in incongruity. When we talk about Arthur Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard as well, two philosophers living in the 1800s who had a very similar view of the world, that if we lose that flexibility and we don't experience the world sort of not quite as what we think it should be or might be, but simply as it is, if we lose sight of that disconnect, then we're ripe for failure. Okay, so the very first person we're going to look at here is Francis Hutcheson. And Francis Hutcheson sort of took Aristotle and Cicero's ideas and developed them sort of in a more comprehensive kind of way during the 1700s. And he wrote a book called Reflections upon Laughter. Now notice that it's not reflections upon humor, but about laughter. So laughter is kind of the sign or the signifier of humor. And we're not at a point now where we're talking specifically about humor, but there's enough in these ideas about laughter that those that came up later on with a notion of incongruity built upon these observations. So the first thing that Hutcheson does is he kind of takes offense, or he takes issue with Hobbes's superiority theory. And of course, by the same token, it would be also Plato and Descartes, but certainly with Hobbes' superiority theory for a number of different reasons. He says, okay, look, Hobbes' idea of laughter always needs to be a kind of comparison between ourselves and others, or ourselves now versus ourselves maybe a few moments ago before we learned kind of a lesson. And in fact, like Aristotle says, we don't always have to laugh at other people. We can laugh at something that doesn't even involve human beings. We can laugh at objects, goofy looking objects, the funny behavior of animals, or even sometimes ideas. A unicorn that farts rainbows. Okay, not the best and funniest joke in the world, but it's an idea that can at least bring a smile to your face, or maybe even laugh. So what's happening here is we're noticing that the source of the humor is not always another human being. It's actually quite different. It can be a whole range of things. So keeping in mind Hutcheson's idea that we sometimes laugh at something that does not involve humans, we laugh at objects, animals, or even ideas, those things can make us laugh. I'd like you to have a look at a clip. I think it's just on YouTube. It's listed as Funny Talking Animals. It's about 2 minutes long, and it takes an idea and kind of really plays with it and runs with it. And what it is, it's the behavior of animals in the animal world, but someone has included or added dialogue to the behavior. So what is incongruous is not only the behavior of the animals, because they're acting just like they typically are, but it's the comedic material that is added to the dialogue between these animals. Therein lies the humor, because at the very least, we don't expect animals to speak or even have a sense of humor. So the comedy is in putting voices to the actions of these animals. So have a look at that. And it's at the very bottom here, like they typically do, down below here. So have a look, and the clips are all ready to go. Have a look at that, and then come back when you're done. So with Hutcheson, he is showing that not only do we not have to laugh at other human beings and their shortcomings and infirmities and so on, that feeling of superiority is not always important. It's not something that is specific, or as he calls it, a necessary condition. Not all humor needs superiority, or sufficient cause for laughter. So both those things, which are typically, if you're using logic in philosophy or logic really in everyday life, you need to either have a necessary condition for something to be what it is, or sufficient cause. So what Hutcheson is saying is Hobbes's idea is it fails because we don't need to be feeling a sense of superiority for something to be funny. So for example, this next clip, which is one that my wife's friend sent to her maybe a year or so ago, and I went, I know where that's going. So here, think of the fact that there's no real connection between feelings of superiority and simply being amused. This clip, very sweet, again, a couple minutes long. Just have a look at it. And Matteo is really trying hard to make his mom understand what's going on. And what is incongruous about it is, first of all, just the degree to which this young man is trying to apply logic to his mother, and verifiable facts and the logic behind his argument. And it's also very funny. It's amusing because I won't say much more because I don't want to ruin it. But it's a funny little clip where we are reminded that we don't have to feel superior to either one of the individuals in this clip in order to find it amusing. So have a look at it, and we'll see you back in a minute. So as we can see, there are different things that are going on in incongruity theory. It isn't about superiority. It's not even necessary. It's not a sufficient cause or a necessary condition. Instead, this particular kind of humor has to do with a contrast, right? A contrast between, in the case of Hutcheson, says a contrast between ideas of grandeur, dignity, sanctity, perfection, truth, justice, beauty. You can go on and on. These are grand themes, right? These are grand ideas. And what happens is we match them up with ideas of meanness, baseness, profanity, things that perhaps belong more in burlesque than it does anywhere else. The notion of having a priest or a nun appear on a burlesque stage is very cheeky and very naughty, as they say. But therein lies the humor. The fact that this person even appears on a burlesque stage by itself is already pretty funny and amusing. But then what do they do with it, right? Do they take it somewhere and really, run with that material? So the notion of a contrast between something high and something low, these two things coexisting at the same time, that's what incongruity is. So what's happening is it's the coming together of incompatible things, right? A contrast between something that is high and elevated and something that is low and base, or something that is proper with the improper, or in certain cases, between the sacred and the profane. So whatever it is, whatever the contrast is, providing it's not too great, because remember Aristotle's sliding scale, right? That's a model and a metaphor we're going to keep referring to. Remember Aristotle saying, if it's just a little bit, it's funny. If it's a lot, it can be terrifying. And we're going to look at that towards the tail end of these slides, because it is an important idea to keep in mind. But here at least, we have the coming together of incompatible things, high, low, proper, improper, sacred or profane, or whatever it may be. So just as an example, here are some, supposed Fisher-Price toys, the Happy Hour play set, the Fisher-Price Tiny Toker. I mean, come on, it's funny. But at the same time, we know that, this is kind of cheeky. I mean, kids aren't supposed to be smoking weed and drinking. So it is the incongruity between the high and the low, the high being the innocence of children, and the low and base behavior of drinking or smoking weed. So therein lies the humor. And I don't want to deflate the humor. It is kind of funny, but when you explain it, it's like, okay, I get it. But it does work. Or this one, Tweeties, right? Obviously, we're making fun of Wheaties, and we know who this clown is. Thank God he's not around anymore. He's kind of off in the stage left somewhere. But, fortified with covfefe, and it takes the mickey out of Donald Trump. And of course, he was president at the time this thing came out, sitting on a toilet. So talk about the high and the low, right? The proper and the improper. So again, what makes it funny is how incongruous it is. The fact that it does mix together high and low, right? A breakfast cereal and a president on a toilet. I mean, it's pretty bad. Now, this last one, thank you, Eric. I wanted to give thanks where thanks is due. Eric, one of our students, sent this to me a couple of weeks ago when we were discussing jokes about the World Trade Center. And he said, I found this and I wanted to see what your thoughts were. Now, Eric correctly identified it as incongruity theory. Why? Because it takes a tragedy like the World Trade Center and 9/11, however you want to call it, and literally collapses it down to this very sort of clinical, generic graph, right? It's trying to compare a tragedy using a kind of mathematical, image of volume or height in this case. So 2000, it's there. 2001, still there. 2002, nothing there. And yeah, it is funny. But when we stop and look at it, we say, yeah, it's funny because of the incongruity of this tragedy, which would be the high part, right? Or the proper part, and the low and base thing, which is to try to represent it in something as as clinical as a graph, right? A chart. Thank you, Eric. A very good example. And again, I take it back. I guess there are ways to find humor in the World Trade Center tragedy or disaster. And this is one of them. And it achieves it by being incongruous. That's what makes it work. Okay, so Hutchinson says that, okay, serious literature, that's where we find, those ideas of grandeur, of greatness, uniqueness, and beauty. And we can find within literature tremendously powerful metaphors, describing sunsets, describing a mountain view, or, a beautiful face. And yes, appropriate metaphors and similes work very well because they clearly identify that which we're trying to imagine in our minds as we read the words on the page. So serious literature typically is involved with using appropriate metaphors. And that's the key. It's an appropriate metaphor or simile, or it could be a symbol that is able to trigger in our minds this sense of grandeur and greatness. So that's how you're able to create great art. You find the appropriate metaphor. So if that's the case, if that is the proper, then the improper or the comedic is when we use inappropriate metaphors to trigger ideas that end up, in the end, clashing one against the other. So if those metaphors are used, they literally pile one on top of the other and almost cancel each other out. And so if you are going for comedic material, you don't want to talk about grandeur in a correct and appropriate way. You wish to undercut it. And you want to use an inappropriate metaphor, something that's just completely wrong. And so you build up these conflicting viewpoints between the metaphor and the idea that it wishes to present. So built on these conflicting viewpoints, built into statements, what's happening is in our minds, we have an idea of what would be probably an appropriate metaphor versus something that is clearly what we're reading. Now again, right, those two parts of our brain are functioning where we're thinking about what is, in this case on the page, and what should be, which is, morally or aesthetically or in terms of great art, what should be there. So comedic genius can be done very, very quickly and effectively by using an inappropriate metaphor. Now, this one here in the slide, a perfect metaphor for my life would be someone trying to stand up on a hammock. Yeah, okay, it's appropriate. It's bordering on genius. It's a really smart way to show the instability of life. Very good. But comedic genius is derived from using an inappropriate or incongruous image or metaphor to describe something. Now, this next clip, I don't know if you've ever seen it. Most people have seen the Parrot Sketch or the barbershop sketch. This is one that if you know Python really well, it's a go-to one because I never get tired of it. Think as you're watching this one, the following idea. Comic genius is a similar ability to use inappropriate metaphors to trigger ideas that clash with each other. The whole point of the Four Yorkshiremen, and in fact, I would recommend before even starting it, put on the closed captions because I just tried it when I checked the link, so you can at least follow along to what they're saying because sometimes the accents might be a little thick. Of course, it's done intentionally because they are from Yorkshire. But here is an excellent example of not only mixed metaphor, but hugely inappropriate metaphors. And they're just talking about childhood. So we have the lofty, the innocence of childhood and growing up and family life and things like that, and the increasingly inappropriate metaphors used to describe it. Now, keep in mind this idea of the building up, right, of layering and layering the absurdity till it finally is just ridiculous. This is a strategy that is really familiar, or at least common, in incongruity theory. Because we find, we start from a premise that is believable, logical, correct, and proper. And very slowly we start seeing it kind of go off the rails because the metaphors become increasingly inappropriate. But therein lies the humor. So have a look at this clip and then come on back. I hope you like it. It's one of my favorites. Okay, hope you enjoyed that one. So one of the very first theorists or philosophers to use the term incongruity was actually James Beatty, who's also another Scottish Enlightenment philosopher. The Scottish Enlightenment lasted roughly 1725 to the very, very early 1800s. So over that 75-year period, a lot of really interesting material was written about morality and ethics, but also about things like laughter and humor. But here we have the first instance of the idea of incongruity as we understand it today. And so what James Beatty writes is the following, quote, "Laughter arises from the view of two or more inconsistent, unsuitable, or incongruous parts or circumstances considered as united in one complex object or assemblage." So there is two or more ideas or objects or people or animals even, or mixture thereof, that are inconsistent, shouldn't be put together, unsuitable, they're improper or rude, or incongruous, and they are considered together as one thing. So the clip I just asked you to watch about the four Yorkshiremen, there's a good example of the metaphors becoming increasingly bizarre, increasingly strange and unbelievable. And the punchline, of course, is, oh, kids don't believe a word you say. Well, yeah, I wonder why. So here James Beatty kind of identifies really the essence of incongruity, which is the combining, right, of inconsistent, unsuitable, incongruous parts, but considered as one thing. Therein lies like the specific idea with incongruity. We are asked to consider both together at the same time. So what is critical for comic amusement is that deviation, right, from that presupposed norm or expectation. So what's happening with incongruity is we are aware of what is proper, lofty, correct, sacred even, and we can see the difference between that and this incongruous element that has been introduced into the picture and the degree of deviation. Now remember, this is happening a little bit for humorous ideas and humorous responses, and that sliding scale wants to make sure that we stay within that narrow perimeter of humor. We don't slip into something further, which is, anxiety, fear, horror, these kinds of things. So the comic amusement is based on that deviation from what is presupposed, what should be there, versus what we're seeing. So there's a kind of a common sense framework that we carry around in our heads that has to do with human behavior, expectations, traditions and norms, these kinds of things. And it's all about the way we expect the world to be. Right? What the world should be. So deviations from it can be mild, it can be severe. And depending on that deviation, it can be humorous or it can be frightful. So the deviation has to be just enough for it to be for comedic effect. This clip here, Jimmy Tatro, who's done a series of YouTube videos, they're actually quite a lot of fun. What he does here, again, his friend is just, asking him about the festival bands that he wears around his wrist. Now, keeping in mind what we just saw in the Monty Python skit, keep in mind what I just mentioned, this piling on of increasingly absurd responses. So the issue is still the same. Why is Jimmy Tatro wearing these festival bands, and what is he going to do about it? Well, what his friend is willing to do to correct the problem, therein lies the humor, right? The deviation from a normal response, a common response, to what it ends up being. And of course, it's funny. At least I think it's still funny, and I've watched this several times. It's how it escalates. It literally escalates out of control. So have a look at it, and we'll see you back in just a minute. So Immanuel Kant. He was also doing a similar thing as Hutchinson and Beatty, which was to develop an incongruity theory of humor and focus perhaps a little bit too much on laughter. But his discussion is still on the way the jokes work and how the joke it gives us pleasure from us picking out that incongruity, right? And what he talks about is often is the structure of a joke. Jokes are typically in three parts, right? We have a premise, we have the confirmation of the premise the second time, and then the deviation, which is the third part. So that's why jokes are built that way. If you stop to think about it, it makes sense. So we need to make sure that we understand this kind of three-part narrative. We understand where the punchline should be. And if a joke was to go further than three examples, we start to wonder, okay, my expectation was the structure, the content is less important than the structure. I'm expecting 3 parts. At the end of the 3rd part, therein lies the punchline. So Kant was looking at how this worked in terms of our understanding of humor and our responses, of course, with laughter. So he looked at it and said, okay, it is where we identify and pick out the incongruity that humor lies. So it still has to do with laughter, and it is correct. But at the same time, it is still talking more so about the structure of humor built on that incongruity than it has a little bit to do with the content. And we'll look at that again a little later when we talk about Roger Scruton. Okay, so Kant writes, laughter is an affection, right, a feeling, is an affection arising from the sudden transformation or a strained expectation into nothing. So what Kant is talking about is the buildup, right? The buildup of an expectation only to have it deflated with that deviation. So we're building up something, it's going to look like this, this is going to be the outcome, and it's suddenly something else. So what happens is the feeling of laughter is that sudden release of tension that's built up through the narrative as it dissolves into nothing. Now, this is a little bit to do with relief theory, and we'll talk about that next week. But already here we can see that incongruity theory does give us some ideas that other thinkers take further on. They take it much further and go, there's something else going on here. But at this early point, laughter for Kant is that transformation of that expectation, right? Because we know we have a worldview that is common to everybody. We know about norms and expectations, and suddenly it dissolves into nothing. And that's where the humor is. So we're playing with ideas, we're playing with structure, and there is a kind of, good feeling that we get from laughter. And of course, sounding a little bit like Descartes, he says, it creates laughter and a feeling of health produced by a motion of the intestines, that kind of, ha, ha, ha. I mean, what's called a belly laugh, right? He's kind of describing a belly laugh. So that's really what Kant is talking about. He's talking primarily about the structure of a joke, more so than the content. But the structure allows us to follow a kind of very brief narrative that could build up to something very serious, only to just poof, to dissipate into nothing. So that dissipation into nothing, that deviation, that's where the humor is. Now, let's be clear. Laughter, writes Kant, is an affection arising from the sudden transformation or strained expectation into nothing. And I write, is this always the case? This clip, I don't know if you've ever seen it before. If you have, obviously the effect is not going to be the same. But if you haven't, think of the idea that Kant is presenting to us, that an affect derived from a very brief narrative. This clip is literally 1.5 minutes long. The sudden transformation or an expectation. We're expecting something to occur. And then we get the punchline. So the punchline, in this case, may not necessarily deflate to nothing. It's a little bit shocking. I mean, it's not rude or cheeky or obscene. It's a little bit shocking, but it is the shock that is it's a deviation just far enough to make it funny. But think of Aristotle and his sliding scale. What if the clip continued on? What if we saw a month later, 6 months later, a year later, the same daughter in the same predicament with these individuals? So I will say no more. Have a look at it. It's very good. Hopefully not too troubling, and I think it's still relevant. But father-daughter chat from SNL back in 2017. Enjoy, and we'll see you back in a minute. Okay, so Kant is talking about how a joke, excuse me, I have to have my tea. A joke negates the tension established in the narrative. And he talks about the strained expectation deflating into nothing. So really what Kant is talking about is partly about incongruity, the deviation that is suddenly presented to us at the end. But it also is a little bit about relief theory, because it is also letting off steam. The humorous sort of component of the joke is not such to cause us grief or worry or anxiety. It's still funny, and we are able to let off steam by just temporarily becoming engaged with the narrative. Not emotionally, kind of logically maybe, or just listening as a story, But that's how humor can be built up through that deviation. So incongruities are typically at odds with logic and reason. For Kant, who was an idealist, who wrote Critique of Pure Reason, big, thick, 500 and something page book, really, really deep and detailed about the ways in which reason work to our benefit, but also the fears that we have of using reason recklessly. So Kant was not a big fan of irrationality. He talked about incongruity, but he was not a big fan of irrationality, simply because he didn't feel that it was right to equate intellectual gratification with irrationality. And what he means by that is we are still keeping in our minds that deviation. We keep in our minds what should have occurred. And that's using our mind in a rational way versus the deviation, what is actually occurring. And therein lies the humor. So the pleasure that we derive, the laughter we derive from a joke, is not so much about the sheer irrationality of it, because we still have to keep in our minds some part of an awareness of what should be. Because incongruity, I will say it over and over again, has to do with the deviation from expected norms and behaviors. That's how the piece is actually funny. Now, a little bit later, Arthur Schopenhauer, living more or less in the first half of the 1800s in the 19th century, he wrote a book called The World as Will and Idea, and he looks at humor in the following way. He says that humor is derived from a clash between the sensuous, right, the tactical world, the world of our senses, sight, sound, touch, taste, and so on, between the sensuous on the one hand and abstract knowledge on the other. Now, abstract knowledge is what we just finished discussing with Kant, this rational view of the world, that the world should obey the laws of gravity. We expect things to behave in a certain way. And when it comes to ourselves, we have expectations of how people will interact with us and will at least respect our personal space. And these days, our personal space is approximately 6 feet, or it should be. But what Schopenhauer is talking about is the humor is derived between what the world actually is that we take in through our senses and what we think the world should be. And so that abstract knowledge, or what Kant is implying, the rational world, that deviation is what is funny. So what he means by this is that we need to kind of constantly correct or reframe our opinion of the world, because our vision, of course, however perfect or utopian it may be, the version that we have of the world in our heads doesn't always match up what the world actually is. Now, it would be nice if it was, but we have some serious, shortcomings in terms of making the world better. And depending on how we view this, we can look at it in a comedic way, or we can look at it in an anxiety-ridden way. If the deviation isn't too far, we still look at it as, okay, it's a deviation. That's all it is. So the version that we hold in our heads and the version that we experience through our senses never quite matches up. It's in a kind of an approximation. So it is the disconnect between these two, what we would like the world to be versus what it is therein lies the comedic material. I had originally, when I first started, a short clip from The Truman Show, but it kind of went on a little too long, but I just wanted to use that as an example, right? And that film isn't necessarily funny. There's some funny bits, but there is almost a tragic kind of pathos, response when we find out what Jim Carrey's character finds out. Now, we know all along, but it's watching him suddenly realize that the world has been completely controlled by other people. He has no free will. And what he does about it, he just decides to walk away. So the world that he envisioned, right, this perfect world, was literally the world he lived in. And for us, luckily, that's not the case. So our world is not always perfect. So Schopenhauer, with that strange sense of humor, he says the cause of laughter in every case is simply the sudden perception of the incongruity between a concept, this ideal world that we have in our minds, and the real objects which have been thought through in some relation. And laughter itself is just the expression of this incongruity. So we'd like the world to be in the following, presented in the following way, but it isn't. So close enough, and close enough when we laugh at it. We just look at people doing stupid, silly things, and we look at them as that. When things are deviating too far, now they may cause concern, anxiety. Think of the clip from last week about the drunken business person trying to go down the escalator the wrong way. People started laughing, but eventually they turned to concern and worry, and people literally were trying to help him. So that sliding scale can shift very quickly. But for Schopenhauer, he's saying that the cause of the laughter is the incongruity between that concept of the real world and what the real world actually is. This next clip here from Tim and Eric, I just want to keep some things that are up to date because Tim and Eric I don't know if they're still on Adult Swim, but they've been doing a lot of stuff. When we think about the cause of laughter being the sudden perception of the incongruity between a concept and the real objects that have been thought through in some relation, think about that as you're watching Tim and Eric's Celery Man, because it is absurd, it is kind of goofy, but when we think of someone that steps into a work environment, a workspace in their cubicle, doing their work on the computer, we kind of expect them to behave in a certain way. So, of course, Tim and Eric take the mickey out of that, and the following clip is Celery Man. So, have a look at that, and we'll see you back in just a moment. So, Schopenhauer talks about humor, and he talks about it in terms of how that world is qualified. And the fact that our humor is derived from us being able to be, remember, not tragic heroes, inflexible, but in fact flexible, forced to readjust our perceptions to it. If we can't do that and we become increasingly, pissed off at the world, we're going to become rather cranky. So what Schopenhauer is saying, much like Henri Bergson was to say roughly 50 or 60 years later, essentially the same thing. If we cannot readjust our perception of the world as it is versus that perfect world that we would like to live in, if we can't do that, then we're bordering on anxiety and tragedy. If we can, and we just kind of stick handle our way through life, and we can, I wish I could come up with a better metaphor, but it's one that really works well. What we're doing is we're constantly reframing, readjusting our worldview to kind of match up with at least the parts that we recognize as being good, and then try to deal with the parts that are not so good. So the punchline in a joke, that's all part of the weight of the joke that is really towards the end, because the punchline is always at the tail end. A narrative has been set up, a story has been set up, and so we wait for that punchline. And depending on how far it deviates from what our expectations were, then we find it funny. But again, we can't take it too far. The deviation is to be just so, and the joke will work. So really what Schopenhauer is talking about is comic amusement, right, that comes from understanding and apprehending incongruity, whatever it may be. So if that's the case, we are considering what is the normal course of events or the normal state of affairs versus what we are experiencing at that present time. And again, it will disrupt norms. It will violate, expectations only to the degree that it causes laughter. So any violation of logic usually is incongruous, right? It's illogical. And if that's the case, if it just goes a little bit, then that in itself is ripe for laughter. We can laugh at it because it's not something we're super concerned with. It's a mild deviation. Now, violations of logic, laws of nature, laws of mechanics, all of these things can be used in order to create a humorous situation. But what we need to always keep in mind is we typically follow norms of morality, of prudence, of etiquette. Those forms of behavior are the ideals that we carry in our heads, the abstract part of the world, right? Not the sensuous world that we experience through our senses, but the abstract world. This is what I would like the world to look like, or I wish the world behaved in this following way. So if we see and think of norms of morality, prudence, etiquette, and so on, if we understand those and we carry those around in our heads, and we do, if we are seeing something that is illogical, reckless, immoral, providing it doesn't go too far, it can be humorous. This is another short Tim and Eric clip, minute and a half or so. Path to the presidency, 2012, I think, 2014. And again, consider the following. We are typically expected to follow norms of morality, prudence, and etiquette, which is why humor trades in reckless and immoral behavior. So Tim and Eric about to announce their candidacy for presidency, and things don't quite work out as well. Now, when I say this, I know already, having seen the clip, what should have occurred, right? The kind of solemn ceremony of announcing a presidency. It's Tim and Eric. So it gets crazy. So enjoy it, and we'll see you back in a minute. Okay, so incongruous humor depends on these norms and expectations and traditions. It also depends on cultural factors and a shared understanding of the world. So we all need to agree on what is considered rational, logical, proper, ordinary, common. All these things are worldviews that we have that we also share with other people. Because those that don't share it with us, those that believe in, a flat earth, that's kind of bizarre because it doesn't fit the common understanding of the world, or certainly the earth. So if that's the case, absurdity works only if we know what to expect. We need to always have those cultural factors, those norms and expectations in our heads, and we don't think about them all the time. It's only when we see them not followed through with that we stop to even think about it, because you stop and ask yourself why something is funny. And again, this is happening within nanoseconds, but you stop and ask yourself why something is funny, and you realize, well, yeah, because they should have done this. This is the reality of what I'm seeing versus what I thought was going to be there. So absurdity works only if we already have an expectation in mind. Otherwise, it's not absurd anymore. It just simply is. So we need to consider what is incongruous. It is always that deviation. So what we need always is that shared background, right? That shared assumption about the world based on intelligence, on ethics, personal hygiene even. And so when we laugh together, we laugh on our own, we are in fact laughing through the acknowledgement of our membership in that community of values, traditions, norms, expectations. Therein lies the humor. So that's what's going on. So if that's the case, we've got Kant that is talking about humor enjoyed for its physical effects. We've got Schopenhauer, who says that there's no problem with the fact that incongruity does offend reason. Kant didn't want that to happen simply because he was someone that really valued that reason was sacred. Reason should not be tampered with and made fun of. But what is happening here with humor is when the concept that we have of the world is not married up very well or reinforced by the reality of what we are experiencing. This clip here, I don't know how well you can see it because I just realized my face is in the middle of it, but that's a shot of Ernie Kovacs that you'll see in a moment, sitting, and this is shot exactly the same way, and he goes to pour a glass of milk from his thermos, and of course the milk goes off in the opposite direction. And the whole thing was built on a tilted stage. So a lot of elaborate design went into a simple little visual joke. But that was Ernie Kovacs. That's just simply what he did. So humor is created when concepts held in the mind are poorly reinforced by concrete reality, by the sensuous reality that we live in. And there's, again, an incongruity. This is a very short clip from the Ernie Kovacs show. As you can see the date, 1960. So 61 years ago. And Ernie Kovacs is one of my favorites. He set the standard for visual humor on television. And he was doing this, I think, out of New York City from about the late 50s. And so I think 58 to 61, 62, because I think he died in 1962. But he did these kinds of crazy ads. And these were Dutch Masters, which is a cigar brand, actually they were paying them money. They were being paid, or Ernie Kovacs was being paid money to create these ads. So even though he was having fun with it, he was still selling a product. So let's remember again, absurdity works only if you know what to expect. It is our expectations that are being subverted when we laugh at something that we consider incongruous. Again, this is about a 1 minute long ad. You can also put closed caption on here because the voiceover really uses some pretty highfalutin words, which are kind of fun to think about. And the film itself, the clip, has a kind of funny visual punchline. But Ernie Kovacs was a master of these kinds of things. So have a look at that, and we'll see you back in just a minute. So Schopenhauer was someone that didn't stress too much about the world as much as he was an idealist. He's one of these really interesting thinkers in the mid-1800s that it's shifting towards trying to understand the material world using ideas, not trying to siphon it through it. But he says the humor reveals the inadequacy of reason, the ways in which reason does falter in trying to allow us to properly conceive the world. And so if there are faults with reason, such as there are faults with ourselves, we can hopefully experience some kind of pleasurable release. Again, there's an idea or a hint at this relief theory that we're going to look at next week. So we experience a pleasurable release from its confusing complexities. So if that's the case, we're laughing because we know the world is complicated. It's not sugar-coated. It's not utopian. It's not perfect. Far from it. It's increasingly difficult. But if we can laugh at the fact that our image or our idea of a wonderful world isn't quite what's actually going on, we should still reserve the right to laugh at it, because it's not something that we should, sweat about so much that it causes the anxiety. So the world is complex and confusing. So if we know that, we can find at least some humor in it. So incongruity is a subversion of common sense. It defies common sense, or it deviates from it. And this occurs when concepts or accepted rules are violated or transgressed. So what's happening is we have an idea about the world, and it is violated, transgressed, deviated only to a certain degree that causes humor. And so we can have jokes that are, intellectual, linguistic. There could be logical errors. There could be puns and parodies, errors of judgment and so on. There's a whole range of different things that we can be doing, but we can certainly stretch common sense to the breaking point. And one of my favorites, and I love to watch this one over and over again, what we've just said here, common sense can easily be subverted by being stretched to the breaking point. I don't know if you've seen this one before, Taco Town ad parody, SNL. Say what you will about the show now. I still think some parts are very funny. Their ad parodies have always been the best. So here is a parody of an ad for some place called Taco Town. Obviously not Taco Bell, but close enough. But when we're watching it, think back to the Monty Python skit of the Four Yorkshiremen, or even Jimmy Tatro, but the festival bands, and the same structure is going on. It starts normally, logically, properly, and slowly but surely it just escalates and escalates with one ridiculous idea piled on top of the other till it just borders on absurdity or borders to the breaking point. So it's a lot of fun. Enjoy it, and I'll see you back in just a couple of minutes. So the other thinker I wanted to look at, I think there's two left here at this point, is Søren Kierkegaard, who also lived during the 1800s, but lived in Denmark rather than Germany, where Schopenhauer and Kant lived. But Kierkegaard also developed his own version of incongruity theory, which doesn't really seem that different than Schopenhauer. And what Kierkegaard says is, when we talk about incongruity, it's our personal belief, or his personal belief, that comedy and humor is fundamental to a good life, because life is born of contradictions. And think about Schopenhauer saying life is complicated, life is complex, the world is complex. And so those contradictions are, for the most part, laughable, because they are usually mild contradictions. More serious ones need a serious tone and a serious approach. But for the most part, Kierkegaard believed that comedy is really useful. It is something we need in our personality and in our day-to-day life because of the fact that life is filled with these contradictions. So when we talked about that sliding scale a moment ago, we were meaning this, that if that contradiction is great, then that can be tragic, right? It can be something that is so awful that it causes us pain. So it's tragic. But a painless contradiction, that can be comedic. And typically a painless contradiction is one that can be resolved. It can be corrected. And that's why with Bergson, when we talked about last week about this élan vital, that we can see people that exhibit really strange behavior, but it's something they can learn to unlearn, as it were, so they can be resolved. So finding a way out of that contradiction, one of the best ways to do it is to use humor. And Kierkegaard did, even in his writings. His writing is full of these really smart zingers that when you are thinking about what he says, you're laughing, but going, yeah, nice call, right? Kind of, you called it for what it was. So Kierkegaard did use humor in his writing, even though he was a philosopher and he talked about existence and so on and serious matters. But he thought that being or having a comedic spirit really was something that made us truly uniquely human. So it was a good thing. It was something worth cultivating because at the very least, it would help us to overcome some of these contradictions that we experience in the world. Now, someone here that I want you to consider is Roger Scruton, who has some issues with the incongruity theory. And he says, okay, look, humor has to depend on a relationship between the joke and reality. And that's true. We've talked about that. But humor depends on congruity. He says a caricature is not a mismatch between a caricature and its object, but rather a fit. So he says, look, humor has to be about things that we recognize. That's why it should be based on congruity. We need to have it based on things we recognize that we can consider and think about. Is this in the realm of the possible? Now, certainly he doesn't have anything to say or much to say about absurdity, but we can at least understand here what he's talking about. That humor is not necessarily built on incongruity, but he says it actually is based on congruity. We need to be able to see that something is going to fit together. And here he talks about this notion of the structure of humor, the three-part structure versus the content. And he says that, look, usually what happens, and again, he is really talking in a very similar way to Kant. Kant also talked about the three-part structure of humor. But he says sometimes it is structural dissonance. We typically, if it's a three-part story, we have the premise, the confirmation of the premise, and in the third part. And Scruton is arguing that the third part, it is the fact that we know the jokes are built in three sections that we laugh at it because it is not necessarily the content. We know it's going to be disruptive, may be illogical, but it's really the structure. We know that the third part of the joke will always contain what is called the comedic material. So the content really doesn't matter so much as that three-part structure. And that gives us a kind of expectation. So he really is talking more about structure rather than content. So the form, we'll say, of the versus the content of the joke. So when he's talking about expectation, what he's talking about is the way in which we know that most jokes are told in three parts. And the third part contains the humor. So it doesn't matter what the humor is, what the content of the joke is. We laugh at the third part regardless, because we know that's where the laughter is. And we do that because we have an expectation that the joke is structured this way. Now, he doesn't say much about, one-line jokes or maybe even just two sentences. There are some comedians that are very good at doing that, where the whole joke is simply one sentence. What do, right? And it could be very incongruous. But the language of expectation, Scruton applies that to the structure of the joke more so than the content. So incongruity is comparative. It assumes that something is disconnected from something else. Something doesn't match up. And so that's one issue that he has with incongruity. The other one is that incongruities are not always funny. And so this is one I wanted to put in because surrealism is a particular kind of art form that thrives on contradiction, incongruity, illogical, sort of nightmarish, hallucinatory, visions of the world. Now, we could still call those incongruities, but we're not laughing at them, right? That sliding scale has gone too far. So with incongruity theory, we need to remember that not all incongruities are funny. Some can be terrifying. Now, this is a line. I'm not making this up. You can look it up on, you can Google a copy of the Second Manifesto. But André Breton, the gentleman here, who was basically the leader of the French Surrealist movement in the 1930s, his sentence, and this is surrealism: the simplest surrealist act consists of dashing down into the street, pistol in hand, and firing blindly as fast as you can pull the trigger into the crowd. That's in there. Now, that's incongruous. But is it funny? Hell no. It's terrifying. So this is kind of what Scruton is talking about. It is more so the structure of the joke that we're laughing at, the expectation of the third part being funny, versus the actual content of the incongruity, because sometimes it can be terrifying. So, for example, an object created by Man Ray called a gift, that's an iron. But take a look at the underneath of the iron. Not very functional, is it? So that's one. Very famous poster. I mean, it's a print, but it's a poster in a lot of students' bedrooms. The Persistence of Memory, 1931. I'm not laughing. I'm perplexed. I'm concerned. It's kind of strange. Watches don't typically melt. Or we have others, Rene Magritte, the red model, which is on the left-hand side, the pair of feet/boots, kind of disconcerting. The portrait of Edward James. Again, these are disconcerting. This is an incongruity that goes beyond humor, right? It's causing unease, concern. We're mildly anxious because that's what these images are meant to do. So they're incongruous, but they're certainly not funny. So incongruity theory can have some problems, at least for Roger Scruton, because he says incongruities typically disrupt our sense of logic and reason. And this is something that we don't usually enjoy. He believes that we're not psychologically equipped or capable of enjoying the irrationality that accompanies any kind of failures of logic or reason. And he argues our physiological need for consonance, right, for predictability, harmony, reason, all those are at odds with incongruity theory, which is why he thinks that we're not typically fans of this kind of humor. But again, the sliding scale is what we need to consider. Is it a slight deviation that is humorous, or is it a tremendous deviation that causes us anxiety? So we need to remember that. The last clip here is, again, from Monty Python. Our physiological need for consonance, predictability, reason are at odds with incongruity. Now, this is, again, a kind of a variation on the sort of stacking absurdity on absurdity kind of structure. Most of you have probably seen this clip before, but it's kind of fun to watch in this context because, as Scruton says, we're not psychologically or physiologically capable of enjoying irrationality. It's not something that we find very comforting. So have a look at the clip, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, and we'll see you back in just a moment. So what does that leave us with? Okay, excuse me. So comic amusement assumes that the audience has a working knowledge of concepts, rules, and regulations about the world, about logic, about reason, and how the humorous content violates it. So we need to always be able to draw from our understanding of the world, right? Whether it's abstract, utopian, or otherwise, our view of the world as we think it is in our minds versus what is actually happening in front of us. So part of the pleasure of humor involves exercising our own ability to assess that background information at a moment's notice. So I want to stress, we don't think about these things all the time until we see a deviation or we experience a deviation. The rest of the time, we simply know what to do, right? We know how to walk and talk and respect one another. But it's not until something happens that disrupts it that we are even made aware that there are norms, that there are rules and regulations. So humor is absent until the incongruity begins to make sense in some way. And it makes sense when we draw, right? We draw on that expectation, the experience that we've had of the world up until now, and how that incongruity has pointed out to us that something isn't right. But that something that isn't right is still considered humorous. It's not frightful. So a joke typically has two sections. One is the creation of incongruity and the narrative, and then this two-part logical process that the listener or reader has to believe in. And what Scruton is talking about is how the narrative has to be both highly implausible, but at the same time just a little bit plausible. In other words, this is ridiculous, but it could happen. So it's still within the realm of the possible, and if it's in the realm of the possible, that slight deviation is where humor lies. So there we go. Just did it in 1 hour. Okay, so lots of clips to watch. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll see each other again on Monday. Some essays are coming in. This is it's about 1:30 on a Saturday afternoon. I'm going to start reading these probably this afternoon. So if you sent them in early, I will be getting to them very shortly. But please be reminded that the first reflection essay and all the information and how to do it and the questions are all available on FOL under the content link. Once you click on that, class assignments, and they are due by tomorrow evening at 11:59. So looking forward to reading them because they're usually a lot of fun. I enjoy just going through them. And again, personal subjective reflections on a topic we've discussed in the course so far, or something brand new. So far, I've not received any emails about a specific topic. If you are going to simply follow through or slightly modify one of the questions, I'm good. I do not need an email, only if it's something completely original. So in the meantime, have a good remainder of the weekend. It's beautiful out there, nice and sunny, but it's still a little bit on the cold side. So we'll see each other very soon, and we'll see you on Monday. Bye-bye.